The story of Sparta is one of the most powerful myths in world history. It is a tale that has been retold for centuries, reshaped by poets, politicians, generals, nationalists, and modern pop culture. It is a story of perfect warriors, flawless discipline, unbreakable unity, and a society built entirely around strength. It is a story that claims Sparta was the ultimate military civilization, a place where every man was a soldier, every boy was trained from birth, and every citizen lived only for war. It is a story that insists Spartans were the greatest fighters of the ancient world, unmatched in courage, unmatched in skill, and unmatched in sacrifice. But the question that drives this investigation is simple. Is any of that actually true? Or have we inherited a carefully constructed lie? The right or wrong question at the heart of this video is this: did Sparta truly embody the warrior ideal, or is the Spartan legend one of history's most successful distortions? To answer this, we must peel back centuries of storytelling, propaganda, and cultural projection. We must examine what Sparta really was, who shaped its image, and why the myth became so much more powerful than the reality. And we must confront the uncomfortable truth that the Spartan legend has often been used to justify violence, exclusion, and authoritarianism in the modern world. The hook of this investigation begins with a contradiction. Sparta is remembered as a society of unmatched military excellence. Yet historically, Sparta lost far more wars than it won. It is remembered as a place of perfect discipline, yet its political system was unstable. Its population collapsed, and its society became increasingly dysfunctional. It is remembered as a land of equality among citizens, yet the vast majority of people living in Sparta were enslaved, oppressed, and denied basic humanity. It is remembered as a place where boys were raised through a brutal training system called the agoge. Yet many historians argue that the agoge was far less organized, far less universal, and far less effective than the myth suggests. And it is remembered as a society that valued strength above all else. Yet Sparta's survival depended on exploiting others, suppressing revolts, and avoiding innovation. To understand how this myth formed, we must begin with the sources. The vast majority of what we know about Sparta comes from outsiders, especially Athenian writers who had political reasons to portray Sparta in certain ways. These writers often admired Sparta's discipline, but they also exaggerated it. They often praised Spartan simplicity, but they also romanticized it. They often described Spartan training, but they rarely witnessed it firsthand. And they often used Sparta as a rhetorical tool, a symbol of virtue or danger, depending on the argument they wanted to make. In other words, the Spartan myth began not in Sparta, but in the imaginations of people who lived elsewhere. This is crucial because Sparta itself left almost no written records. The Spartans did not produce philosophical texts, historical accounts, or political treatises. They did not write down their laws. They did not preserve their own stories. Their culture was built around oral tradition, secrecy, and a deliberate avoidance of documentation. This means that almost everything we believe about Sparta is filtered through the biases, agendas, and misunderstandings of outsiders. And those outsiders often had every reason to exaggerate. The myth grew even larger in later centuries. During the Roman era, Sparta became a symbol of ancient virtue, admired by elites who wanted to contrast their own society with a supposedly simpler and more disciplined past. During the Renaissance, Sparta was revived as an example of civic virtue and moral strength. During the Enlightenment, it became a model for political theorists who wanted to imagine alternative forms of government. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, Sparta became a favorite reference point for nationalist movements, militaristic ideologies, and even fascist propaganda. The image of the perfect Spartan warrior was reshaped again and again, each time becoming more exaggerated, more idealized, and more disconnected from reality. But what was the reality? To answer that, we must examine the structure of Spartan society. Sparta was built on a rigid hierarchy. At the top were the Spartiates, the full citizens who had political rights and military obligations. Below them were the perioikoi, free but non-citizen inhabitants who handled trade, craftsmanship, and economic activity. And below them were the helots, an enormous population of enslaved people who worked the land, produced food, and endured constant surveillance, violence, and oppression. The helots were not simply enslaved, they were terrorized. Spartan society depended on keeping them in a state of fear, because without their labor, Sparta could not function. This is one of the most important truths about Sparta. Sparta's military system existed not to conquer the world, but to control its own enslaved population. The Spartan army was designed primarily to prevent helot uprisings. The agoge was designed to produce men who could enforce internal order. The discipline of Spartan society was shaped by the constant fear of revolt. And the myth of Spartan strength was built on the backs of people who were denied freedom, dignity, and humanity. This reality is often ignored in popular portrayals. Films, games, and modern retellings focus on Spartan bravery, but rarely mention the helots. They celebrate Spartan discipline, but rarely acknowledge that it was enforced through violence against enslaved people. They praise Spartan equality among citizens, but rarely mention that citizens were a tiny minority. They admire Spartan simplicity, but rarely mention that it was made possible by the labor of others, and they glorify Spartan sacrifice, but rarely mention that Sparta's military failures were frequent, costly, and often catastrophic. To understand why the myth persists, we must examine the psychology behind it. The Spartan legend appeals to people who admire strength, discipline, and unity. It appeals to those who want to believe in a society where weakness is eliminated, where citizens are perfectly loyal, and where the collective is more important than the individual. It appeals to those who want to imagine a world without complexity, without contradiction, and without moral ambiguity. And it appeals to those who want to believe that greatness can be achieved through simplicity, austerity, and force. But the truth is far more complicated. Sparta was not a utopia of strength. It was a fragile society built on oppression, fear, and stagnation. It was a place where innovation was discouraged, where economic development was limited, and where political power was concentrated in the hands of a small elite. It was a society that struggled to adapt, that suffered demographic collapse, and that ultimately faded into irrelevance. And it was a society whose myth became far more powerful than its reality. This chapter sets the stage for the deeper investigation that follows. In the next chapter, we will examine the agoge, the training system that has become the centerpiece of the Spartan myth. We will explore what it actually involved, how it functioned, and why its portrayal in modern culture is often misleading. We will also examine the experiences of those who were excluded from the Spartan ideal, including women, helots, and marginalized groups, whose stories are rarely told. And we will continue to ask the central question: was Sparta truly the warrior society it claimed to be, or have we inherited a carefully constructed lie? To understand the Spartan myth, we must examine the institution most responsible for shaping it, the agoge. Popular culture portrays the agoge as a brutal, hyper-efficient training system that transformed boys into perfect warriors. Films depict children fighting wolves, surviving starvation, and enduring endless combat drills. Games portray the agoge as a military academy where every boy becomes a soldier. Modern retellings describe it as a system of absolute discipline, absolute loyalty, and absolute strength. But the historical reality is far more complicated and far less dramatic. The agoge was not a universal training system. It did not include every Spartan boy. It did not operate with perfect consistency. and it did not produce the kind of elite warriors that modern mythmakers imagine. In fact, many historians argue that the agoge was less about military training and more about social conditioning, a way to create obedience, conformity, and loyalty to the Spartan elite. The agoge was designed to produce citizens who would maintain internal order, enforce discipline, and suppress the helot population. It was not designed to produce soldiers capable of conquering the world. The structure of the agoge reveals this truth. Boys were taken from their families at a young age and placed into groups where they learned obedience, endurance, and group loyalty. They were taught to endure hardship, but they were not taught advanced military tactics. They were encouraged to steal food, but punished if caught, a lesson in cunning, not combat. They were subjected to physical challenges. But these challenges were often ritualistic rather than practical, and they were taught to respect authority, but not necessarily to innovate or adapt. This is one of the most important misunderstandings about Sparta. Spartan training emphasized conformity over creativity. The agoge did not encourage strategic thinking, technological innovation, or tactical flexibility. It produced citizens who followed orders, maintained discipline, and upheld tradition. But in warfare, innovation often matters more than discipline. And Sparta's rigid system made it difficult for the society to adapt to changing military realities. The myth of Spartan military superiority is further challenged by examining their actual battlefield performance. Sparta did produce skilled hoplites, heavy infantry soldiers who fought in tight formations. But hoplite warfare was common across Greece, and many city-states produced excellent hoplites. Sparta's reputation for military excellence was shaped by a few key victories, especially at Thermopylae, where a small Spartan-led force resisted a much larger Persian army. But Thermopylae was not a victory. It was a symbolic last stand, and many of Sparta's other military engagements were far less impressive. Sparta suffered major defeats throughout its history. It struggled against the Thebans, who developed new tactics that outmaneuvered Spartan formations. It struggled against Athens, whose naval power exposed Sparta's lack of maritime skill. It struggled to maintain control over its own territory, facing repeated helot uprisings that threatened the stability of the state. And it struggled to adapt to new forms of warfare, especially as other Greek city-states began experimenting with combined arms tactics, cavalry integration, and more flexible formations. The myth of Spartan invincibility ignores these failures. It focuses on a narrow set of stories that portray Spartans as fearless warriors, while ignoring the broader historical record. It celebrates Spartan discipline, while ignoring the strategic limitations of their rigid system. And it glorifies Spartan sacrifice, while ignoring the suffering of those who lived under Spartan rule. To understand the full picture, we must examine the experiences of those who were excluded from the Spartan ideal. The helots, who formed the majority of the population, lived under constant threat. They were forced to work the land, produce food, and support the Spartan elite. They were subjected to ritualized violence, including the Cryptia, a secret police force, composed of young Spartans who were encouraged to kill helots to maintain fear and control. The helots were not simply enslaved, they were terrorized. Their lives were shaped by oppression, surveillance, and brutality. Women in Sparta experienced a different kind of exclusion. Popular portrayals often depict Spartan women as unusually free, strong, and influential. It is true that Spartan women had more economic rights than women in many other Greek city-states. They could own property, inherit wealth, and manage estates. But these rights existed because Spartan men were frequently absent due to military obligations. Women were expected to maintain households, produce strong children, and uphold Spartan values. Their freedom was limited by the expectations placed upon them, and their lives were shaped by the needs of the state. Marginalized groups within Sparta also faced exclusion. Non-citizens, foreigners, and those who failed to meet the strict requirements for citizenship were denied political rights. They were often essential to the functioning of Spartan society, providing trade, craftsmanship, and economic activity. But they were excluded from the Spartan ideal, treated as outsiders, and denied the privileges of citizenship. These realities challenged the myth of Spartan equality. The idea that Sparta was a society of equal citizens is deeply misleading. Citizenship was restricted to a small elite, and that elite depended on the labor of others. The vast majority of people living in Sparta were not citizens, not warriors, and not part of the idealized Spartan image. They were essential to the functioning of the state, but excluded from its political and cultural identity. The myth of Spartan simplicity also deserves scrutiny. Sparta is often portrayed as a society that rejected luxury, embraced austerity, and valued simplicity above all else. But this portrayal ignores the economic realities of Spartan life. The Spartan elite enjoyed significant wealth, much of it produced by helot labor. They owned large estates, controlled valuable resources, and benefited from the exploitation of others. Their simplicity was not a rejection of wealth, but a cultural performance designed to reinforce their identity. This performance was part of a broader strategy of myth-making. The Spartan elite cultivated an image of discipline, strength, and virtue. They used rituals, symbols, and traditions to reinforce their identity. They discouraged written records to maintain secrecy and control, and they shaped their society in ways that made it difficult for outsiders to understand the full reality. This secrecy allowed the myth to grow because outsiders filled the gaps with imagination, admiration, and exaggeration. The myth of Sparta became even more powerful in later centuries. During the Enlightenment, political theorists admired Sparta's discipline and civic virtue. They used Sparta as a model for alternative forms of government, often ignoring the oppressive realities of Spartan society. During the 19th century, nationalist movements embraced the Spartan ideal as a symbol of strength, unity, and sacrifice. And in the 20th century, militaristic ideologies used the Spartan myth to justify authoritarianism, violence, and exclusion. This chapter reveals the deeper truth behind the Spartan myth. Sparta was not a society of perfect warriors, but a society built on oppression, conformity, and fear. Its military system was designed to maintain internal control, not to achieve external conquest. Its training system emphasized obedience, not innovation, and its cultural identity was shaped by secrecy, performance, and myth-making. In the next chapter, we will confront the central question directly. We will examine the evidence, analyze the myths, and determine whether Sparta truly embodied the warrior ideal, or whether the Spartan legend is one of history's most successful distortions. We will also explore why the myth persists, who benefits from it, and why it matters today. The final step in this investigation is to confront the central question directly. Was Sparta truly the warrior society it claimed to be, or have we inherited a carefully constructed lie? To answer this, we must examine the evidence, analyze the myths, and understand the forces that shaped the Spartan legend. We must also explore why the myth persists, who benefits from it, and why it matters today. The first truth we must acknowledge is that Sparta's military reputation was shaped by a small number of symbolic events. Thermopylae, the most famous Spartan battle, was not a victory. It was a dramatic last stand that became legendary because it symbolized sacrifice, courage, and resistance. But Thermopylae was not representative of Spartan warfare. It was an exceptional moment, shaped by unusual circumstances, and elevated by later storytellers who wanted to portray Sparta as the ultimate warrior society. Other Spartan victories, such as those in the Peloponnesian War, were achieved not through superior tactics or unmatched skill, but through alliances, strategy, and the weaknesses of their opponents. Sparta's eventual victory over Athens was made possible by Persian funding, naval support, and political maneuvering. It was not a triumph of pure military excellence, but a complex outcome shaped by diplomacy, economics, and circumstance. Sparta's defeats reveal even more. The Battle of Leuctra, where the Thebans shattered the Spartan army, exposed the limitations of Spartan tactics. The Theban general Epaminondas used innovative formations that outmaneuvered the rigid Spartan phalanx. This defeat was catastrophic for Sparta, leading to the collapse of its political power and the liberation of the helots. It demonstrated that Spartan discipline could not compensate for strategic inflexibility, and that innovation often matters more than tradition. Sparta's inability to adapt was one of its greatest weaknesses. The Spartan system discouraged change, innovation, and experimentation. It valued tradition above progress, conformity above creativity, and stability above growth. This made Sparta vulnerable to societies that embraced new ideas, new technologies, and new strategies. Athens, Thebes, and other Greek city-states developed naval power, cavalry integration, and flexible tactics. Sparta remained committed to its rigid hoplite system, even as the world changed around it. The myth of Spartan military superiority also ignores the demographic collapse that plagued the society. Sparta's strict citizenship requirements made it difficult to maintain a large population of full citizens. Over time, the number of Spartiates declined dramatically, reducing the size of the Spartan army and weakening the state. This collapse was not caused by external enemies, but by internal policies that prioritized purity over practicality. The Spartan ideal became unsustainable, and the society struggled to maintain its identity. The myth also ignores the economic stagnation that limited Sparta's growth. The Spartan elite discouraged trade, craftsmanship, and economic development. They relied on the labor of the helots, but did not invest in innovation or expansion. This made Sparta vulnerable to more dynamic societies that embraced commerce, technology, and cultural exchange. Athens, Corinth, and other city-states developed thriving economies, while Sparta remained isolated and stagnant. The myth of Spartan equality is another distortion. Citizenship was restricted to a small elite, and that elite depended on the labor of others. The vast majority of people living in Sparta were not citizens, not warriors, and not part of the idealized Spartan image. They were essential to the functioning of the state, but excluded from its political and cultural identity. The idea of Spartan equality ignores the oppression of the helots, the exclusion of the perioikoi, and the limitations placed on women. The myth of its simplicity is equally misleading. The Spartan elite enjoyed significant wealth, much of it produced by helot labor. Their simplicity was not a rejection of luxury, but a cultural performance designed to reinforce their identity. They used rituals, symbols, and traditions to create an image of discipline and virtue. This image was part of a broader strategy of myth-making that shaped the perception of Sparta for centuries. The myth of Spartan strength also ignores the psychological impact of living in a society built on fear. The constant threat of helot uprisings shaped Spartan culture, politics, and identity. The agoge was designed to produce citizens who could enforce internal order, not to achieve external conquest. The crypteia was a tool of terror, used to maintain control over the helots. The discipline of Spartan society was shaped by fear, not by strength. The myth persists because it appeals to those who admire strength, discipline, and unity. It appeals to those who want to believe in a society where weakness is eliminated, where citizens are perfectly loyal, and where the collective is more important than the individual. It appeals to those who want to imagine a world without complexity, without contradiction and without moral ambiguity. And it appeals to those who want to believe that greatness can be achieved through simplicity, austerity, and force. But the truth is far more complicated. Sparta was not a utopia of strength. It was a fragile society built on oppression, fear, and stagnation. It was a place where innovation was discouraged, where economic development was limited, and where political power was concentrated in the hands of a small elite. It was a society that struggled to adapt, that suffered demographic collapse, and that ultimately faded into irrelevance. And it was a society whose myth became far more powerful than its reality. The final answer to the central question is clear. The Spartan ideal is a myth. It is a distortion shaped by outsiders, exaggerated by storytellers, and used by modern ideologies to justify violence, exclusion, and authoritarianism. The reality of Sparta was far more complex, far more fragile, and far more human than the myth suggests. The myth matters today because it continues to influence modern culture, politics, and identity. It is used to justify militarism, nationalism, and authoritarianism. It is used to promote the idea that strength requires sacrifice, discipline, and conformity. And it is used to create a false image of greatness that ignores the suffering of those who were excluded from the Spartan ideal. Understanding the truth about Sparta allows us to challenge these distortions. It allows us to recognize the dangers of myth-making, the importance of critical thinking, and the value of complexity. It allows us to appreciate the real history of Sparta, not the exaggerated legend.